Take it away.
Do I need this?
I don't know.
Well, first of all, apologies for not speaking in Danish. And as a typical Brit, I don't know that many languages, including English. But I'd like to thank you for your patience in waiting for me to come here. I thought the meeting was 7 o'clock actually, so I wasn't panicking too much. I was okay. But this issue of economics and Marxism has certainly become more and more relevant, I would say, particularly to young people and the new generation that is emerging at this stage. I remember in the 1990s and the 2000s, the catchphrase then was we're entering a new economic paradigm, and that we are entered a new stage in the development of capitalism, and it looked as if things were going to be get better and better and better. He wrote a lot of books at the time about the stock market in particular, which was booming, and they thought it was going to upgrade various titles of the Dow Index reaching 30,000, 40,000, 50,000 and so on. And there was no glimmer at that stage of a possible crisis of capitalism. People didn't talk about those kind of things. In fact, you had the efficient market hypothesis was, again, one of the trendy ideas which was floating around, that leave capitalism to itself, to the market, and it would reach equilibrium. It would resolve its problems, and in reality there wouldn't be any boom and slump of capitalism, which has plagued capitalism for 200 years. And somehow things had fundamentally changed, and therefore this new period opening up would be totally different, was totally different, in which the crises and contradictions of capitalism were no longer applicable. I do remember 2007 when Alan Greenspan was asked a question, well, do you think there's going to be a recession? And at that stage there was a few clouds on the horizon. So he said, well, not more than 1 in 3 chance is there going to be a recession in the next period. Of course, in relation to Britain, where I'm from, they said, well, if there's going to be a recession, it will be very, very mild in Britain because we got so many banks and so much finance houses that it will be a lot more milder in Britain. And that was the kind of ideas put forward by papers like the Financial Times. Not exactly a Bolshevik newspaper, certainly putting forward very much a pro-capitalist, serious capitalist position and programme. And yet we saw problems occurring in the United States, the subprime mortgages that were being sold, were being defaulted on. We saw in Britain a bank, Northern Rock, be defaulting. It was the first run on a British bank for 140 years. So again, something was happening here. Something was certainly shaking things up. And yet it took a full 12 months or more for this crisis to reveal itself in all its forms. And in September, October, and the months that followed the 2008, you have the biggest economic crisis of capitalism since the 1930s, in living memory, and probably since the 1930s. Some even say that's the deepest crisis of capitalism in the history of capitalism, because of the scope. So many countries involved, far, far greater than the 1930s. This, therefore, was one of the most serious crises that they'd ever faced. They didn't believe was possible. But all the ideas of equilibrium had gone up in smoke. And now we have the bare face, if you like, of capitalist crisis, which created enormous panic, obviously. The banks were in fear of collapsing. and that capitalism itself was on the precipice. This is not my view. This is the view of the serious strategists and apologists of capitalism. And they demanded action very quickly from government. Although in the past period they talked to the market, leave the market, it'll deal with itself. Forget government, too much regulation. Now they wanted more regulation in order to prop up capitalism, of course. And you had Ronald Reagan presiding over, the public ownership of the car industry in the United States, of banks being propped up, of Fannie and Mae, which has been in existence for a while, then being taken over by government institutions. This was not just in America, but in Britain and throughout Europe itself. There was absolute panic at the collapse that was taking place. One day after another, the news was broadcasting difficulties, bankruptcies, bailouts, emergency summits, you name it, it was all happening. And of course, that's what happened. There was a big bailout of the capitalist system, of the banks in particular, or they were taken into public ownership, like we had in Britain, in order to make them more profitable so they could be handed back to private ownership at a later stage. So this was a means of preventing, as they saw it, a depression. Everything was thrown at this situation, the kitchen sink, everything. But above all, trillions and trillions of dollars on a world scale was pumped in to capitalism in order for it not to enter a period of depression, as was the case in the 1930s. They developed this idea also of quantitative easing that had never been heard of before. Simply manufacturing money by central banks in order, as a trickle-down, I suppose, theory of encouraging capitalism to be spurred on, to encourage it to revive. Because they had seen in the past, obviously, well, you can have a slump, but it's always followed by a boom. So, they were expecting quite confidently that this great crisis, which had shaken the whole capitalist system, that had brought back all evils, if you like, of the past, that somehow, well, things will get better tomorrow or the next day. Things will return to normality, normal. That was the case in the past period. Although and then you had very small recessions. 1974, 1979, 81, 1990, 1991, 2000, 2001. They were all small by comparison. And each of them led to a revival, a recovery. And that's where they were hoping, that this would be the case today. Why not? Although the most serious, I would say, economists, bourgeois economists, recognized that, something fundamental had happened here. Something had gone fundamentally wrong. That this was a qualitatively different crisis in 2008 to any other crisis that had occurred previously, particularly in the post-war period. That you had on the one side a colossal mounting of debt that had been accumulated. Prior to the crisis, you had credit, which was freely available, cheap credit. And everybody partook in this credit, including myself. And of course, the only problem with credit is you have to pay it back with interest. And although you could create a bubble, a credit bubble, which was the case, nevertheless this bubble would burst and you'd have the biggest, knock-on effect of this crisis, compounding the recession. And therefore you have a mounting of debt throughout the capitalist world, particularly in Europe, but throughout the capitalist world itself. And therefore, combined with a fall in production, which you had 2008, 2009, and a very slight growth after that, very, very minimal growth. Obviously, capitalism, governments could not afford the reforms that they had given previously. Therefore, there was a period now of austerity was needed in order to balance the books. All the ideas of the 1930s in relation to balanced budgets and austerity all come back into fashion as if this was the real means of solving the problem. Of course, they had debt. They needed to get rid of debt. Although I just saw last week in preparing for this talk, or rather, it was not last week, it was today. In today's Guardian newspaper, there was an article that said that debt has grown. It's not, they tried to cut down the debt, but it's grown since 2008 by $57 trillion. A bigger growth rate of debt than you have of an economic growth rate, which gives you kind of an idea of how things have slowed down, and how things are getting more complicated for capitalism. So you have a growth of debt. In fact, even in Britain, it's a freebie newspaper. Spending on credit hits 10-year high. This is in Britain. And there was articles, it's in my bag actually, I could dig it out later. Articles writing in saying, well, the reason for that is the living standards are going down, that benefits are being cut, wages are being cut, therefore we have to borrow in order just to keep our head above water. That's what many people are writing in about. So we've got this complicated feature of a colossal debt which is getting bigger. We have a recovery which is not the recovery. It's limping along. In the United States, you're talking about, well, in the second quarter of this year, they really did well. They were, thumbs up for this. They said it was growing, the American economy was growing at 3.9%, which is quite a figure, 3.9% compared to the past. But when you strip down the figures, you saw the majority of this was inventories. In other words, stock that had been built up in the previous period that they couldn't sell. It's stacked in the warehouses, but it's regarded as part of the GDP. And of course, last week, we have the second figures for the third quarter, and they expected 1.7% now, a half of the rate it was previously, but it came in at 1.5%. So the American economy at this point, 1.5%. After the collapse in 1929 in America, 1933 onwards, the economy grew by 9%. That's how fast the recovery was in the 1930s. In the Depression, it was 9%. This time they're looking at 2%, and it's hallelujah. So that shows how capitalism has become more and more exhausted, if you like. And all the things that they have attempted to do in order to revive capitalism have not really worked. Quantitative easing I've just mentioned. They stopped it in America. It's still going in Europe. I think it's 66 billion a month has been pumped into the economy. And now they're extending it. They're talking about extending this. Japan, they've had quantitative easing as well for the last period. In fact, you could say for the last 25 years in Japan's case. Japan was the second biggest economy in the world. I remember growth rates in Japan of 10%. In the 1950s, Japan had growth rates of 20%. Now it's recession. It's been like that for the last 20-odd years. That's an indication of the motor of capitalism is seizing up in relation to the second biggest powerful economic power in the world at that time. So, things are happening here which didn't happen before. Quantitative easing, well, pumping money in or creating electronic money by central banks in order to buy bonds, in order to buy securities, in order to try and stimulate the economy and reduce long-term interest rates, has run into the sand. Is this what they got? Is this it? 7 years we've had of recovery, so-called. 7 years. And yet the International Monetary Fund, about 2 weeks ago, explained that 2015 will be, in dollar terms, there will be a fall in production on a world scale, fall in GDP on a world scale. The first time since 2009. And there is the crisis. This gives you a bit of a flavour of the realities facing capitalism at the present moment, 7 years apparently after the recovery, 7 years after the crisis that was affecting the world economy. So we have the build-up of money being pumped in various ways, not doing much good, although you could say that that money has been doing something, usually being pumped into areas for speculative reasons or into the emerging markets. There's been a big flow of capital into the emerging markets over the past number of years. But the main capitalist powers have been in the doldrums, for want of a better word, particularly in Europe, but also in the emerging economies now, which were the saviour in the past, by the way. The reason why 2008 wasn't a depression like the 1930s was, on the one hand, China, and the other hand, by the growth of the emerging economies, these brick economies, as they call them. But now these economies are all slowing down. China, which had huge growth rates, the last quarter, 6.9%, if you believe the figure. The reason why, if you believe it, the other figures, other economists have looked at the Chinese economies and analysed particularly electricity output, the banking sector, and rail freight as three particularly important gauges of an economy. And they said, really, the Chinese economy is growing at a rate of 3.1%. And that is half of what they talk, the official figures are really about. And that is resulted in a collapse of commodity prices and a glut of excess capacity, which is spewing out across the world. So rather than in the past, it was a help to prop up capitalism, now it's a lead weight dragging it down. And China hasn't seen the last of it yet. I mean, in the last 12 months, they've reduced interest rates by 6 times. The stock market, the bubble, the crisis, they poured in $200 billion into it to try and revive. They gave up in the end. They have enormous amounts of excess capacity because you can only increase the capacity so much for the world market. In other words, China has to export or it's had it. That was the picture in the past period. You had to export. But if America's not buying, if Europe's not buying, then, and the emerging economies are also being affected, well, why should China produce? So China's volume of production is going down, leaving enormous amounts, which in effect then is affecting iron ore, affecting cement, affecting all the commodities from these countries of Brazil, South Africa and so on, Australia, which pumped in a lot of commodities into China. They're all being affected. They're all being downgraded. In fact, the IMF comes out every few weeks and downgrades. Everything's been downgraded. In Brazil, they're talking about an 18% fall in GDP this year in dollar terms. In Russia, 35% fall. Just a little indication of how things have turned into its opposite, as Karl Marx would have said in relation to dialectics. But this, and not only with quantitative easing, but also interest rates. Interest rates have been reduced to negative. I'd never heard of a negative interest rate before in my life. Till recently, negative interest rates. There's a chap named called Hal Dane, I think his first name. He's one of the chief advisors of the Bank of England in Britain. Well, obviously Bank of England in Britain, yeah, would be. And he said, on the basis of what's been happening in interest rates, it's been the lowest interest rates we've seen for 5,000 years. That's before Jesus Christ threw out the moneylenders. 2,000 years before that, 3,000. Unbelievable. I mean, that's the kind of figures you're bouncing around at the moment. Negative interest rates, and what have they done? It's nothing. There's no recovery. You know, for some people borrow on that basis, it is true, because interest rates are low. But they borrow not for productive investment, because investment is falling. What they're borrowing for is speculation. You know, mergers and acquisitions. which is now booming at the present time, particularly when companies are buying back their own stock. It's a good way of pumping up the value of your company. Buy back your own stock. Force the prices up. It's obviously a charade. It's a complete charade. It doesn't create any extra wealth in society, but certainly can increase certain dividends, bonuses, and probably other such income. I saw at the FT, in fact, the other week, that earnings were going down, but profits were going up. I thought, well, how the hell can that doesn't make sense. And the guy who wrote the article in the FT said, well, because of cutting costs. If your income's going down, there's only one way of pushing up profits. That's cutting your costs. And that's, again, it's like sitting on a branch of a tree and sawing the tree that you're sitting on. That's exactly what capitalism is doing at the present moment. And of course, it's in a dire crisis. Now, it's not me saying this. I mean, I've got lots of quotes. I don't want to bore you to death with quotes, but wasn't it Lawrence Summers, who was the Treasury Secretary to Clinton? He's a professor now in some Harvard University or something. He says, well, what we got now is secular stagnation. Well, I knew what stagnation was, but I wasn't sure what secular meant. So I looked in the dictionary, and secular means a very long time or 100 years. So stagnation of 100 years. That's the prospect. This guy is not a Marxist. This guy is a, true blue capitalist supporter. But he recognizes the dangers of capitalism and the impasse at the present moment. Secular stagnation. Martin Wolf, who's the chief economist in the Financial Times, called it a managed depression. Well, you can argue whether it's managed or not, but certainly it has the features of a depression. Stagnation, prolonged stagnation, a lack of demand everywhere, lack of investment everywhere. That's the situation we have at the present. 7 years after the crisis, when there should have been a boom. There's no boom. So what you're looking at here is like things which you've never contemplated, like a permanent crisis. Or even when, like mass unemployment is returned. Austerity is returned. Of course, they say, well, austerity is important to cut down, to balance the budget, and therefore allow capitalism to get on an even position, an even keel. But austerity means cutting wages, cutting the social wage. And if you cut the wage, you'll cut the market. You don't have to be Einstein to work that one out. You cut the market, then the capitalists don't want to produce if there's no market. They don't invest if there's no market. And investment is a very important element of capitalism. Without investment, it cannot develop. Investment has been the key to the last 200 years of capitalism. In fact, that's the purpose of the capitalists, if you like, is their historical justification is the development of the means of production. It's developing the productive forces, industry, technique, science, by investment. Of course, it's not thought out in that way. They invest in order to compete. They invest in order to take a slice of their competitors. They invest in order to defeat their competitors. And that's what they do. But in doing so, they build up the productive forces. But now they're not investing. And this is a very, very dangerous situation. This means really that capitalism no longer is playing the historic role it played in the past. It has exhausted itself. I mean, it was Marx who explained about crisis. And he said, well, profit comes from the unpaid labour of the working class. He said that the working day can be divided up between necessary labour time and surplus labour time. In that part In an 8-hour day, for instance, if you had 4 hours where the worker produces enough values to cover his or her wages, then that is the necessary time they have to work to do it. And after that, it's surplus time. In other words, he or she doesn't go home after producing enough values to cover their wages. They've got a contract, and the contract says you work an 8-hour shift. So you work until the end of the shift. And the other 4 hours is what Marx termed as surplus labour, or where profit comes from. And in that equation, you will see, obviously, well, hang on a minute, the worker who only receives 4 hours of wages, how can that worker buy back the full produce that it's creating? In other words, the full 8 hours of value. The worker cannot do it. Otherwise, there would be no profit. And Marx said, well, how do you overcome this thing? Well, if that was the case, capitalism would collapse on day one of its existence. It would say, that's it. We can't. The only way around that is for capitalists to take the surplus made by the working class and invest it. And that produces a market itself. Marx talked about two different departments. Department 1 and Department 2 of production. One that produces consumer goods, and one that produces capital goods. And he said it's the interplay between these two sectors which create a market. Obviously, the workers in these two sectors want consumer goods. The bosses in these two sectors also want some consumer goods, preferably some luxury goods, but nevertheless they want some consumer goods. The capitalist in one sector needs to buy capital goods, more machinery to keep the plant going. And the same way in the other sector. So that they create, if you like, this interaction which develops a market. And that allows capitalism to move forward, to develop. In fact, you read your Communist Manifesto, Marx says that capitalism was a revolutionary system of society, given what it's produced. It's created a world market, enormous increase in the developed productive capacity of human society. Such is the revolutionary role of capitalism. Of course, it does it not in a conscious way, but in a contradictory way, through competition, dog-eat-dog, through striving to get more profit over someone else, you cut costs. Eventually, you drive someone out of business, and you become more and more, you create more and more of the market. You become a monopoly, if you like. And from competition, you get monopoly, said Marx. And today, well, 500 companies could dominate the entire world. 500. Amazing. Such is the concentration and centralization of wealth at the present time in the 21st century. But if capitalism is working this way, why doesn't it just keep on going? Well, the problem is that it comes a point when there's a period of overproduction, that the market is not doesn't grow sufficiently in size to cope with the enormous amounts of commodities flooding onto the market. And the reason for that is the capitalists don't know what the market can bear. And there's lots of different capitalists who are producing for this limited market. And eventually there comes a point when overproduction appears. We've got that now in a lot of areas. Even now, it's symptomatic of a coming crisis. In Britain, they've been shutting down steelworks, Tata Steel, in a number of areas. ISIS, steelworks. Thousands have been thrown out of work. There's too much steel. Well, they say it's too much steel. The commercial needs for steel is not there, which is a very important point to make. And capitalist economists make this point. We're not interested in needs as such. We're interested in demand that can pay. In other words, if you've got money, fine, that's what really counts. Not because you want something. I want a lot of things. I can't have them because I haven't got the money. And that applies probably to a lot of people. So it's not needs. It's the selling of the good at a profit which is vital. In other words, but that has its limits because of this contradiction. The working class cannot buy back the value it produces. And now we have at this stage, as I said earlier, the capitalists are not investing. So all this is coming to, it's like gear crunching in a car. The whole of the capitalist system is slowing down as a result. There's no investment because there's no market. There's no market because there's no investment. In other words, here you have a series of vicious circles in capitalism, which are contradictions, that have reached their limits at the present time. In the past, capitalism could overcome their problems, yes, by making greater contradictions in the future. Well, that's the future. We'll get there sooner or later, but this is the future. But now we're in the future, insofar as the contradictions are now bearing fruit at this level everywhere. In China, massive overproduction. They call it excess capacity. You know, they don't like using overproduction. There's not nice terms. The excess capacity. And look, what does that mean? It means they've got too many machines. They've got too many factories that can produce goods. But these goods cannot be sold rather, at a profit on a world basis because the market is sagged. And therefore, there's a cut down in production. And this is mad from a historical point of view. No society has ever reached a period where it overproduces. You know, you had slavery underproduced, feudalism underproduced. And when it's foggy, when it's bad weather, where there's plague, where there's a natural disaster, then you have scarcity. But capitalism is the first economic system, social system, that actually produces a scarcity. That it runs on a scarcity. Capitalism doesn't produce goods, it produces things for profit. And that's the acid test. And therefore we have this overproduction taking place everywhere with unemployment. It's a mad idea. I just saw a film the other day, Martian. We saw it, it's in the cinema, it's The Martian. You haven't seen it, obviously. Well, I tell you, if there was Martians alive and they came down to Denmark or to Britain, they'd go back very quickly because they think these people are crazy. They've got all this industry and it's idle. They've got all these people unemployed. There's 73 million people unemployed, they reckon. That's the ILO statistic. Half of them are under the age of 25. I mean, this is the wastage of capitalism. That's the whole point now. It's become a system that's wastage. Wasted talents, wasted human resources. And then they say, well, that's the whole purpose of capitalism, isn't it? Creative destruction. That's what it's all about. You destroy things in order to create things. And then they say, well, yeah, the only problem is now we've not destroyed enough. That's the problem. We've not destroyed enough. The 2008 crash and the slump that we experience and the after effects now means that capitalism hasn't done its job properly. It should have destroyed more things. Should have destroyed them so it allows the market to revive a bit more. That's what they're talking about. And why is it the case? They say, oh, because of interest rates. Interest rates are so low, they're keeping firms alive which should be dead. And they call this zombie capitalism. Yeah, believe me, they call it zombie capitalism. You know, firms which are half alive and half dead. It's kept going. And it should be... And that's why they say there's excess capacity. Interest rates are so low, they have to try and encourage capitalism. At the same time, it cuts its throat. So this is the contradictions that capitalism has. Of course, that's probably not new. My son, he's on, I mean, there's been a huge attack, not on my son, there's been a huge attack in the last 30 years on the working class to increase the rate of profit. The rate of profit was declining up until 1983. And then this almighty attack, starting in Britain, of course, we're always first. Margaret Thatcher attacked the working class, squeezed the working class, introduced privatisation, all the things you could possibly do to squeeze more profitability out of the working class. And they did it. And that's why we got today, where there's no the term, contracts, they're out the window. All the things you had in place, or you had in the 50s and 60s, they're gone. It's short-term contracts. My son, he's done a university degree in Glasgow. He's got 3 jobs. 3 0-hour jobs, he told me the other day. So I go 15 hours one week, 20 odd another week. You don't know what you're doing from one week to the next. And he's got a degree. Pity those who haven't got a degree. In the 1930s, in the docks, they used to line up people. And they used to pick, you work today, you work today, you work away. They don't have lines anymore. They just text you. And that's the situation we've got. We're going back to the 1930s of Dickensianism, if you like in British terms. We're going way back. Capitalism can no longer afford the reforms of the past. That's why they're destroying the reforms. They're undermining the reforms. They can't afford it. Of course, there are others, well, what about Keynes? Get Keynes back. Surely, can we have a deficit, a deficit on the finances? And because obviously in a slump, there's no demand. It's true. So can we artificially make demand and therefore let it go a bit? But that's no answer. Insofar as who pays? At the end of the day, money or demand has got to come from somewhere. You either tax the workers. If you tax the workers, you cut the market. Or you tax the capitalists, you cut investment. Or they're not investing anyway. I mean, the figures I got in Britain, they're sitting on a cash mounting of £800 billion. I don't know what that is in krona, whatever it is. And in the US, they're sitting on $2 trillion worth of cash. And this is, in other words, capitalism, they don't want to produce anything. They want to make money without producing things. So they've got derivatives. They've got these financial jiggery-pokery things, these funny things they've made. And no one knows what the hell they are. They cut debt up and they package it up like a Christmas present. And they stamp it with approval. This is good. This is worthy of interest. And they send it and they sell it. I mean, derivatives is what Marx called fictitious capital. It's fictitious. And do you know how much is around at the moment? Well, in 2008, I got the figure, in 2008, there was $500 trillion worth of derivatives in the world. 10 times the actual amount of global GDP. 10 times the wealth of the world. I mean, this is the madness it's accumulated to. So capitalism is chaotic. Capitalism is diseased. Capitalism has run out of steam. It's on its last legs. And it wants to take us down with it. And therefore the working class has been made to suffer because of this crisis of capitalism. So Marx wasn't an economist. He wasn't an economist. He was a philosopher. He was a historian. He was a revolutionary. And what he explained was that this capitalism wasn't here forever, as they all say, capitalism is the best thing since ever. No, capitalism was simply a stage in the development of society. And like everything, it rises and it falls. And that's the whole point. At the moment, we're in a period of crisis of capitalism, qualitatively different from the past. And remember, the 1930s, yes, there are similarities with the 30s today. But the reason why they got out of the 1930s was because of World War. It wasn't a New Deal in the United States. America went at a second crash in August 1937. It was the war production and the World War and 50 million dead that rescued capitalism. Well, there's not going to be a world war now, I don't think. Otherwise, there'll be a nuclear war and there'll be ashes left. And at least the capitalists want to profit at the end of the day, so they won't be keen on ashes. So there's not going to be a world war. So all these problems that they solved in the past through World War are now going to be internalized. They're going to be pushed back into the system, even further contradicting the system itself, mangling the system. Of course, who pays? Well, the working class. You know, there's always a way out for capitalism. There's no final crisis of capitalism. They can always find a way out at the expense of the working class. But with such consequences, well, you know, that's the whole point. Permanent austerity, 100 years of stagnation, that's the perspective that the capitalist strategists have at the present time. All we say is that capitalism creates its own grave digger in the form of the working class. The working class has been subjected to these horrors, these pressures of food banks, unemployment and attacks. And they haven't seen anything yet. I mean, in Britain, I can talk about Britain, the Tory government are talking about cutting public expenditure by 40% up until 2020. There'd be nothing left. There'd be nothing left. Do you think the workers are going to sit back and accept it? Well, you know, you can have your back against the wall, but you can't go back much further. And there's a resentment. That's why you got Jeremy Corbyn, shall I name his name? Leader of the British Labour Party. Amazing. Pinch yourself just to think that he's the leader of the Labour Party after all those years of Blairism. But that's a product of the discontent in society, which has now got to manifest itself in Corbyn, or in Spain with Podemos, or Syriza in Greece, or even Bernie Sanders in the United States. You know, he says he's a socialist and he's fighting for the Democratic nomination. But he's got audiences, I know this is a big audience here, but he's got audiences of 10,000 and 20,000. Now that says something for the United States of America. An avowed socialist having those kind of meetings. What is it? People are waking up. People are being affected by this capitalist crisis. People are very conservative, it's true, in their outlook and psychology, it's true. But there comes a time when, you know, things snap. And that's what a revolution is, actually. It's a rapid change in consciousness, that's all it is. People just say enough is enough, and that's the end of it. And I see that the Donald Tusk, he's the head of the European Union, or Commission, I should say. He was the Prime Minister of Poland, the right-wing guy. He's saying we've got to be careful. In Europe, there's another 1968 coming. Now, for those of you who don't know what 1968 is, it's where we had the French general strike, where 20 million workers went on strike, where Europe was aflame of revolution at all. Young people, even I was a little kid. School students, get all the school students out, workers came afterwards. It was a period of revolutionary movement of working people. And that's what they're afraid of. That's what's coming. Because these attacks have got to lead to a backlash. And I was going to quote, but I can't remember where the quote is. But believe me, that's what they're saying. A backlash is coming. The crisis cannot be resolved unless over the backs of the working class. And therefore, I'm a socialist, I'm a Marxist. I think we should say to hell with capitalism. If it can't work, if it can't give us a basic thing, a job, a house, a decent education for your children, basic things like that, then to hell with it. And working people should have the ability to plan this economy. You can imagine if it was planning. It sounds, dirty word, planning. Free markets, all great, free markets. In Henry Ford's in his car factory, he doesn't have a market. You know, the wheels don't have a competition with the driving seat. On the gearbox as a competition with the exhaust. But they plan it. Inside the capitalist factory, they actually plan things. Because that's the only way you can produce something. It's pretty elementary, but that's the truth of it. But instead of having the management of capitalism on your back, imagine if working people had control of their lives, of industry, and the productive wealth of society, then what wonders you could produce. Because instead of the wastage, you can put every talent to use. Whereas the capitalism is the opposite. And now you have the spectacle of 66 individuals 66 billionaires have more wealth than half of humanity put together. That's the product of capitalism, of the centralization of wealth, which is embedded in capitalism. I know Piketty has got a book out, well, we can tax it, we can tax the rich. Look, they've tried taxing the rich for years. When I was a youngster, they used to have 90% tax in Britain. We weren't living under socialism, I assure you. It's not, the only way is to take the real wealth of society, the factories, the banks, the productive wealth, and use them for people's needs. Wow, what a revolutionary idea. Using things for people's needs instead of profits. Why not? We're not living in the Stone Ages. This is an idea that's come its age. The age has come. And that's why we must bring this conclusion to this talk, if you like, that the only way that capitalism, as far as I can see, is going to be through one crisis after another. And they're talking about another world crisis as deep as 2008 next year. Whether it's next year, they don't know. They haven't got a crystal ball, and neither have I. All I'm saying is all the symptoms there are ready for a new collapse. And that collapse will mean a depression. And that depression will mean a further intensified attacks on working people. In other words, here's the revolutionary moods which will develop, on a world scale is coming. And our task, I think, is to ensure that this mood is successful. And not like the horrors of the 30s with fascism, of dictatorship and all the other things they used to defend their system. We have put that into the graveyard and bring about a new society. A society where all the talents are used to the full. That we can reduce the hours of work. What a wonderful idea. I've got it in here. They talk about the 40-hour week. The 40-hour week is killing us, it says. Because we don't have a 40-hour week anymore. It's 50 and 60 hours. And the 40-hour week was what? In the 1880s, in the 1890s they were fighting for that. Now it's back, we've been thrown back. And the stress that is in work, the way in which workers are treated in order to make the rich richer, even richer. I think I've said enough. I can understand some frustration, about what's the answer, what's the alternative? You've got good criticism of capitalism, and I'll probably take another lecture or another talk, really. I mean, I have gone, in Britain we've got a lot of Marxist societies in different universities. We'll discuss capitalist crisis, or what does socialism be like, or how to get it. In other words, there's lots of topics, lots of issues and questions that you can't necessarily deal with in 5 minutes or 10 minutes. And need to go into a bit more detail. At least the questions being asked, and that's the most important thing. Before I go into that, though, just a couple of points. When I said there was not going to be a world war, I didn't mean to say that therefore there's not going to be no wars. Obviously there are wars in Africa, wars in the Middle East, and wars have been going on since the Second World War. But these are local wars, regional wars, nevertheless still devastating, and millions of people die. And that's a product of capitalism itself, this rivalry. Obviously is imperialism, attempt to develop spheres of influence, and with that, or set up puppet regimes. I mean, imperialism is very good at that, attempting to displace governments and put in friendly governments for the interests of the big powers in society. And where they come into conflict, obviously that creates tensions and can lead to regional wars and so on. That's part of the course. All I'm saying is I don't believe necessarily that there was going to be a world war, that's all. Because, well, who's going to fight who? Who's going to take on the Americans, the Chinese, or what? And if they were going to do it, it would lead, as I said, to nuclear war, because you can't have a war on the basis of conventional warfare, not now anyway. It's true is that if Hitler had nuclear weapons in 1945, I'm sure he would have used them. Therefore you have the idea, if there's a dictatorship that can be out of control, particularly in Western Europe, then that raises a colossal danger in relation to this kind of issue. But I've said that at the present time, it's not likely to be a war in the foreseeable future, a world war. And therefore the contradictions of capitalism will be more deeper and more extensive, more inward looking, if you like. Marx explained, well, it's the task of the working class. You have classes in society, you have a capitalist class, who own the means of production. That's what gives them their wealth. That's what gives them their power. That's what gives them their basis in society. And, they control the universities. They control the news. They control the newspapers. The ruling ideas of today are the ideas of capitalism, because they are able to use their power and privileges and position in order to spread those ideas. And there are many people who try to justify capitalism and obviously not argue for any alternative. There's no alternative, as far as they're concerned, to capitalism. But within that, nevertheless, the working class, which exists, although there are some academics who say, well, working class no longer exists. Well, if it didn't exist, well, who made that desk, and who turns the light on, and who made the mobile phone, and who made the clothes you're in, and how are you going to get home tonight? The working class certainly exists, and they produce the wealth in society. The only thing is, as the questions have been posed, they're always downtrodden. They get the worst education, they get the worst housing, they get the worst health, yet they produce the wealth. And the people on top, the 1%, they don't produce the wealth, and yet they take all the wealth. And we say that the system of society is now breaking down. Whereas in the past it kind of delivered some of the goods, now it's no longer delivering the goods. And therefore you need a fundamental revolutionary transformation of society. You can't do it in half measures, I don't believe. You can't tinker with it. If you did, they'll destroy it. It's like going back, 200 years ago, a man who was a Welshman, just like me, Robert Owen. He was a great utopian socialist, and he built, these little communities of socialism. And they went down, because you can't have islands of socialism in a sea of capitalism. That's how he explained it. Eventually the sea will just consume it. And therefore, however you could start into little workers' cooperatives and so on, they always get taken over, they always get destroyed in one form or another, particularly when there's an economic crisis. So we have to think a bit further than that, and we have to say, look, you can't plan anything unless you control something. And you can't control something unless you own something. It's as simple as that. And that these big monopolies, banks and so on, which dominate the economy, whether it's in Denmark or elsewhere, need to be taken out of the hands of private owners, which are running it for profit. They have to be nationalised, I would say, without compensation, because they've made enough money. I'm not talking about the small kebab shop or fish and chip shop. Well, I don't have fish and chip shops here. But the small little grocery shop. I'm not talking about small little businesses, no. I'm talking about the big giant monopolies and banks that dominate the economy. Take them over and run them under workers' control and management. Who knows better how to run something than the people in the factories, in the workplaces themselves? In fact, the bosses used to have a suggestion box and to try and pick the brains of the worker. How can we best improve things? You'll get an extra $5 if you tell us how to improve things a lot. The only thing is, if you improve things too much, people get made redundant. Because at the end of the day, we could run things on all the automation we've got, all the robotics that is there, all the technology that exists, all the scientists that exist. I think 95% of all scientists who ever lived are alive today. The only thing is they are largely controlled and directed by big business of what needs to be invented. Look at the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, you probably could cure the common cold, but they don't want to because it's not profitable to do that. They'd rather sell, different medicines, because they make a large cut on it. They could solve these things, but they don't want to because it's against the vested interests of capitalism. I think we'd all agree with this. We can see the rottenness of it. But it's surely therefore we have to take over the pharmaceutical industry, take it out of the hands of big business, and put it in the hands of ordinary people, nationalise it under workers' control and management, and run it with the scientists for people's needs, genuine needs, not looking for profits on every single drug that they can do. And that's one of the ways that we can do it. But the only way you can plan the economy is take it over. I said, not the small bits, but the giant firms. They then can invest, they can plan, they can reduce the hours of work. Why should we work 50, 60 hours a week, 40 hours, whatever? We can work 20 hours or 10 hours a week with the same living standards so that everybody gets a job, everybody gets involved. Society, in other words, we are using the full talents of people to the full. They can do other things as well. At the moment, what has class society been? The rich and privileged have always got away with everything. They've had a monopoly of culture. They've had a monopoly of art. They've had a monopoly of knowledge in many respects. That can be broken down if we take power out of their hands and put it in the hands of the working class. That means a revolution. There's no other way of doing it. You're not going to say, oh yeah, that's fine, we give up, we surrender. No class, no caste, privileged individuals have ever given up their power and privileges without a struggle. That's true. But this is a 1% of people. The vast majority of people, if they are conscious, if they were organised, they could take things like that very peacefully. Unfortunately, as was said at the back there, that some of the parties, what we brought in, the social democratic parties, don't operate for working people, they operate for capitalism or careerism. And therefore they've been taken over and they have been, if you like, transformed into props for capitalism rather than, as they originally were started out to be, parties to overthrow capitalism. So therefore the only thing is for working people, I would say, either to create their own party, new parties, or get rid of the old parties themselves, cleanse the old parties. I myself am a member of the international Marxist tendency. I believe that Marxism does have a major role to play, because Marxism is the memory of things. Reformism has a very short memory. Marxism has a very long memory. We like to learn about revolutions of the past. Why? So that we don't make the same mistakes in the future. There have been many revolutions taken, including the Russian Revolution. Unfortunately, in a backward country, surrounded by imperialism, 70% of the people couldn't read or write, growth of bureaucracy, and it destroyed the revolution. You can't have socialism in one little country, and particularly a backward country. Capitalism is a world system. You have to have a world socialist system to replace it. Of course, things can happen in different individual countries, but it's like what Kissinger said. We can have a domino theory. Because of the discontent that exists everywhere, and it is profound. Everywhere you go, no one's happy. I mean, you're all happy, I know, but no one's happy generally. Because they're stressed out. They've got all the problems of the world on them. And they're looking for an alternative. They'd like an alternative. But no one comes on the television and says, we've got an alternative to capitalism. We think we should do away with the profit motive. We should nationalise the big corporations under workers' control and management. We reduce the working hours to 20 hours or 10 hours. You can imagine if you went on the TV in Denmark and said that. Of course they won't, because the parties you got there are status quo parties. If we have to build, as we are attempting to do, the international Marxist tendencies as groups in different countries, preparing the way for a movement, yes, of the working class. We can't change society. We are too few. It's those out there who's going to change society. The millions of workers are going to change society when they be conscious of this need to do it. And as I said, it's not, you don't get it from books. You don't, unfortunately, get it from newspapers. They learn from events. It's events, and more events, which force people to act. And I would say a lot of people know what they don't like, but they don't necessarily know what they want, if you like, what they're searching for. It's instinctive, but they're not conscious of it. If you had an organisation, a Marxist organisation, a socialist organisation, that could fight for these ideas, if you like, it's a tinderbox there, isn't it? People are pissed off. I don't know if is that a word? They are disgusted about things. They would like to do something, but they're kept down. You need to build an organisation. You need to build a new leadership for working people, in order to prepare for the events that are coming. If capitalism is in crisis, what does that mean? Revolution's coming. That's what it means. But the big question for me is it going to be a successful revolution? Revolutions have been there for the last 100 years. And they've been defeated or derailed and so on, mainly because of leadership. And therefore our task, I would say, is creating an alternative leadership when a movement takes place, that you can give leadership to so that the revolution is successful and not derailed as has been in the past. That requires Marxism, because Marxism learns about revolutions, learns about changing society, generalizes it into understanding and ideas and theory. But of course you have to link with the working class. It's the workers will change. Whether we're here or not, there's going to be a revolution. Because it doesn't depend on us. It's society creates revolutions. People don't wake up at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning, I fancy a revolution. They're forced into it by events. They don't see any other way out. It's not one person, it's a generalized thing. And then they act. Then they try and seize and change things. And the thing is that they have the power. But the thing is, you need a leadership to guide that movement, like a piston box. It's like steam, isn't it? Steam is very powerful. In the Industrial Revolution, steam was a very important component that could, when it was put through a piston box, drove locomotives. Well, the working class is a bit like steam. There's enormous potential power, but it's got to be, if you like, pushed through a piston box, galvanized, if you like, in order that this strength can be used to change society. Of course, that is the task of the hour. The alternative is, well, Marx didn't work out a fully fledged alternative. You read Capital, you read all his writings, he won't say, this is the new society, I've got a note on what it's all going to be like. He says, workers will make the new society, people will make the new society, once they have the power in their hands. But clearly, it'll be extremely democratic. You'll have the power being in workers' hands. They'll have the wherewithal, they have the ability to mould and develop the economy in the needs of people. And that will transform people. Look, one successful revolution, just one, in any country of the world, will set a flame alight. It will transform the whole entire situation because of the anger, the bitterness, the frustration which exists there now under the surface. Of course, when I say, well, fascism is not a danger, insofar as you're not going to have the mass forces of fascism like the 1930s. But you can have reaction, you can have racism and so on, which has to be combated, of course. And a lot of people get, confused when there's nothing on offer, and they can go in all sorts of directions. But once the working class moves into action, when that power is displayed, that can win over all layers. It'll dispel all illusions and prepare the ground to change society. Of course, we need a new meeting to go into all these details. This is just a little sketch that I'm giving you here. Because all I'm saying is, patch up capitalism, it can't be done. It's been tried. It cannot be done. You can't abolish the contradictory laws of capitalism by this little change or that little change. It has to be done away with completely. By doing away with it completely, you have the resources to create a new society. That's the whole idea of socialism, which cannot be done in one country. Capitalism has created a world economy. It's created the material basis of socialism internationally. And therefore, the idea of socialism must also be international. Workers have never been so strong. Look at the 1930s. You had enormous peasantry in Europe. I think in Germany, 40% of the population were peasants in 1930. Today, the peasantry has been practically eliminated. The working class is enormously strong everywhere. White-collar workers have become blue, if you like, have joined the working class. Civil servants, bank workers, and so on. In other words, with the potentials there, it's never been greater. But the thing is to make it conscious of itself. And that's why Marxism, or the role of Marxism, is attempt to make conscious the unconscious feelings or desires of workers to change society. But it's events that will do it. But I think this has been a great meeting. It's raised a lot of ideas, a lot of questions which need answering. Couldn't answer them all. But at least it's a beginning. And I hope you'll have many more discussions of this nature to raise your level, to read what Marx said. Read for yourself. Conquer these ideas. What did Marx say? What did Lenin say? What did Trotsky say? Read them for yourself. Conquer these ideas. Because they are more relevant today than ever before. Because of what is coming. A clash of the classes, I would say, internationally. And therefore, revolutionary events will unfold. And once one unfolds, you'll have a knock-on effect throughout the entire world. That's the future. And once that happens, it's a question of being conscious of change in society on socialist lines, and therefore preparing the way for a new future. Yes, of plenty, where you don't have overproduction. It's a ridiculous idea that we plan things for what we need, use the resources of the planet in a way that it can be sustained, of providing free housing, of providing free education, of free transport, of free medicines. All these things will be possible on the basis of planned economy, and thereby changing the world. That's what it's about. Capitalism is in crisis. It's time to change it. Join us. Thank you.
Ja, tak for det. Det var dagens program. Jeg vil igen anbefale folk lige at kigge på bogen. I hvert fald lige kigge kort her. På den her bog. Selvom for 150